If you had told me 10 years ago that Hyundai was going to be the car company to bring us a fully modern three-row EV with over 300 miles of range and nearly 430 horsepower, I would have said that sounds far-fetched. But that's what we're looking at today. This is the all-new Hyundai Ioniq 9. And this is the first time I have seen this out in the real sunlight and, of course, driven it because I'm down in Busan, South Korea, driving this and driving it over 2 days and nearly 600 miles of driving to really find out, can this deliver Hyundai's promise of insane horsepower, under 5 seconds 0 to 60, and over 300 miles of range in every single model, even the one with these big wheels and tires. If I start chattering at any point, it's because it's been freezing for the last 2 days here, literally below 32 degrees in Seoul. But let's take a look at the design here. Up front, you'll notice that this does not look like an inflated Ioniq 5. Hyundai decided that their cars didn't need to look like Russian nesting dolls, unlike some car companies out there. And I appreciate that, even though in my head, I think I would have liked to have seen a large-sized Ioniq 5. I think this actually looks better to my eye. We have the same unifying elements, though, in the design. That's what really ties everything together. These pixel elements for this light bar, these are the turn signals and these chunky modules on each side. We have the multi-module LED headlights below with a ton of modules in here, as you can see. And then an interesting illuminated panel on the side. Lots of detail work is going on in this design, and I really appreciate that dedication to detail. So we have more pixel elements behind this clear section here in the bumper with the black elements behind, radar sensor right there in the middle, 360-degree camera, and kind of innovative active arrow shutters below. Those not only flip and fold, they actually push out to try and really seal off the front. So at higher speeds, Hyundai is saying this has an even better aero profile than the Ioniq 5. Although when you look at coefficients of drag, remember, they're coefficients. This is still less aerodynamic in terms of its total drag than an Ioniq 5, but for something this size and shape, it's actually pretty darn aerodynamic. Now, coming around to the side for a moment, this is really quite a big three-row EV, and that's really its claim to fame. It has a usable third row, a big cargo area in the back, and it's significantly more practical on the inside than something like a Tesla Model X, because that has a very egg-shaped profile. Now, unquestionably, the roofline drops to the rear. That's probably the most controversial design element, but that's necessary in order to get over 300 miles of range. But oddly enough, we'll talk about this in a bit, you actually get more headroom in the third row than we get in the front row, and that's because of the all-electric platform. This rides on the same eGMP platform that underpins the Ioniq 5 and Ioniq 6, but it has been stretched to incredible proportions. This has a wheelbase over 123 inches. That's nearly a foot longer than the Hyundai Palisade. But the look is very different. They decided that the Palisade, which is going to get a refresh here real soon, and the Ioniq 9 did not need to look identical. Now, there are some controversial consequences to that. If we take a look here, you'll notice that we have this sort of eyebrow over the wheel arch. Hyundai says they wanted the visual effect of a squared-off wheel arch. In the lower-end trims, this would actually be black, but they give you this sort of little eyebrow to help tie it all together because the round wheel arch is more aerodynamic. I think they should have leaned into the round wheel arch. This just looks better to my eye. The wheels, though, these have really grown on me. It's kind of an interesting turbine-style wheel here. They're really focusing on aerodynamics, and I'm surprised that something with this many spokes is this aerodynamic. Also, 285/45 R21 tires on this one. Regardless of the version of the Ioniq 9 you're looking at, the tires are really wide, 255, 275, or 285 with tires. This one still has 311 miles of range with this size tire on it. Now, one word of caution, I am driving a South Korean market Ioniq 9 today. Not everything you see on this model is going to come to America, most notably the side view mirror cameras. I'm not the biggest fan of this design. We'll talk about why when I get this out on the road, but they do have a positive effect on the aerodynamics. This is much sleeker and smaller than those big elephant ear style side view mirrors, so it does have an improvement when it comes to the highway range. Up here we have aerodynamic rails, roof rails. We also have a panoramic roof that opens on the calligraphy trim and a lot of silver accents all the way around. As we come all the way to the rear, you'll notice the continuation of the pixel design elements. I think this design looks really good on the Ioniq 9, and it certainly gives me a bit of Volvo wagon, especially Volvo wagon from maybe a few generations ago. The light bar goes all the way across the top. So this top part is actually the third brake light, and then we have the additional brake lights all the way down there. Amber turn signals on the side. It's a really distinctive look. If I had a personal preference, I would prefer a single light pipe all the way around instead of the individual pixel elements, but that's part of what gives this that unique vibe and unique flair. The Ioniq 9 logo is flush mounted with the hatch. That's a really cool touch as well. So instead of the logo being stuck on and popping out of the woodwork or metalwork here, this is actually flush with the surface there. The button to open the hatch, that's there on that side. And we have a cargo area that's over 21 cubic feet back here. It expands to nearly 50 cubic feet if you fold the third row seats. So if you're looking for something that has actually more practicality than you find in the average gasoline three-row vehicle, you might want to check out something like the Ioniq 9. This is not as big on the inside as something like a Chevy Traverse, but it's actually not as big on the outside either. However, as far as passenger comfort, it's pretty close to some of those really big three-row crossovers. For the first time in an Ioniq model, we get an electric release for the hood and a bigger front trunk than we find in the rest of the Ioniq lineup. It's going to depend on whether you get the rear-wheel drive or the all-wheel drive model as far as the exact capacity. It's about 1.5 cubic feet in this model, about 3 cubic feet in the rear-wheel drive version. And yes, this is going to start as a rear-wheel drive EV. 215 horsepower in the rear, and your choice of around 93 horsepower up front or 215 horsepower. So Hyundai will give you a smaller motor in the front or the same motor front and rear depending on which version you get. This model is 429 horsepower total. At the moment, it is the highest performance version, but we're pretty sure there's going to be a higher performance one coming soon because the EV9 has a GT model with an awful lot more power. Whether we're going to get that in an Ioniq 9N or maybe an N-line, we're just not sure at this point in time. One big difference between this and the Kia is that this has a bigger battery. It's a brand new 110.3 kilowatt hour battery pack. That's not only bigger than the one in the EV9, it's actually almost 15% larger than the one that we find in the Tesla Model X. And that's how this gets over 300 miles of range in every trim. Over 330 miles of range if you choose the rear-wheel drive one, but even in this performance model with those 285 width tires, you get over 310 miles of electric range. Charging happens behind door number 6, and interestingly in South Korea, we're going to find a CCS charge port and the J1772 port that's pretty familiar to North American shoppers, but not in the United States. In the US, every model is going to have the J3400 or NACS charge connector and native Tesla supercharger access. Although, if you want to charge this as quickly as possible, you're going to want to use the included CCS adapter and go to an 800 volt charging station, because this is an 800 volt EV. I use air quotes there because the exact voltage of this battery pack is likely around 650 volts or so, but it's going to charge pretty rapidly. You're going to go from 10% to 80% in under 30 minutes, and that's a big deal when we're talking about something with 335 miles of electric range. An important thing to know about the Ioniq 9 is that every version sold in the United States is going to be built in the United States, and the battery pack is going to be built in the US as well, specifically the new Meta plant near Savannah, Georgia. So most likely this will qualify for the full $7,500 tax credit, as long as that tax credit hangs out. Now let's take a look at the inside, because this is the big reason to get the Ioniq 9, is just that the interior is huge. We have lots and lots of headroom. This model has the panoramic moonroof that opens. There's just gobs of headroom going on here. And oddly enough, you have more headroom in the third row than in the first row. Now in the second row, we have some really interesting things going on here that we may or may not get in the United States. I'll scoot over to this side so Sophian can come in and show what's going on. Big shout out to Sophian from Redline Reviews for playing videographer for me today. This is the captain's chair model. You're going to get either 6 seats or 7 seats, depending on the version you're looking at. But I bet that we're not going to get these really kind of interesting vibrating second row seats. They not only massage, they actually vibrate, kind of like those, movies you've probably seen from the 1960s where there's a magic fingers bed or something like that. It is really quite relaxing. I had not expected this to be this interesting. Now, in the back, we also find features like 100-watt USB-C charge ports for the second row and the third row. There are actually 6 of them total. So this can output 600 watts of USB-C charging. If you got MacBooks and you just want to charge 6 of them in here, you can do that. The touchscreen rear entertainment system, I'm not sure whether we're going to get this in the United States. I'll take a look at that in just a moment, but we are going to get the sliding second row console. We are going to get some form of power sliding second row seat, but not the kind that swivel. and either go 90 degrees so that we can get child seats in and out more easily, or turn around to face the third row. Hyundai says that they believe that that's not going to pass North American crash standards. Unfortunately, we're not going to get them as a result in the US. But if I go back here to the third row, you'll notice two things. The first one is legroom could be a bit better back here. We have about 116 inches of combined legroom in the car, but Hyundai has chosen to make the front and second row seat rails move really far backwards. So there's lots of legroom up front, and in the default position, that means a little bit less legroom in the third row. If, however, you power tilt slide that seat back, it actually stops in a position where we have a decent amount of third row. So by default, if people are getting in and out, you get this much legroom, but if you move that second row seat all the way back, then you're going to get less. The third row, that's always going to be 2 seats only. I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity because there's no such thing as an 8-passenger EV in the US right now other than a van, and this could have been that 8-passenger vehicle. It would have been a little bit of a tight squeeze, but I think they could have done it. Headroom, that's insanely generous back here. Admittedly, seat bottom cushion is not terribly high off the ground, but you know, I think I can forgive them for that. The rear seats have a power recline function that is kind of cool. And then again, 100-watt charge ports there. Lots of hard plastics back here in the second row, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. Nowhere to put your elbow that is padded. For the second row passengers, if I can squeak out there, I will say that these power sliding seats take a bit of time. They're not exactly my cup of tea. Back in the second row, one other thing that I dislike is that we have cup holders in the doors rather than some sort of cup holder arrangement in the center console. If you have kids and they have takeout drinks and they put them in here and then they close the door, let's just say there's going to be Diet Coke all over the inside or whatever it is your kids are drinking. Hopefully not orange Fanta, because that would be a disaster in this interior. Now, I was wondering how child seats might fit in the Ioniq 9 because ostensibly this is going to be a family-focused EV. Well, let's find out. If I power slide this second row seat all the way back, we get a shocking amount of room here. So in my typical child seat measure, where we measure 11 inches up the seat back and then across to the front seat back, this is adjusted for me. That is 33 inches. That is quite a lot of room. So you'd have no problem fitting those large rear-facing child seats back here, as long as you didn't get the rear seat entertainment system, of course. Now, if you noticed this interesting little perforated section on the second row seat backs and were wondering what on earth is that, we found out this is the air intake for the ventilated seat back cushion. The seat bottom cushion's air intake is under the seat, but because of the way the second row seat articulates, they had to put the air intake for that function right there. Well, you probably wouldn't be able to put 6 people's worth of luggage back here for a road trip. If Sofian comes in close, you can actually see how these 22-inch roller bags fit back here. There's a reasonable amount of space left in that cargo area. You can fit quite a lot of luggage. We had no problem comfortably fitting our big bags for this week-long trip here in Korea. And if I take everything out, we also find a bit of additional storage space under the load floor. I kind of wish they had restructured things to make this area flat. You'll notice that there are some bumps and bulges here for some of the other electronic systems, but I think that Hyundai has done a really good job packaging everything. If you take a look at a decent number of EVs, third row packaging and cargo area packaging is actually a bit of a challenge because that motor has to be in the back and all the cooling systems, etc., for that motor are back there as well. That means that generally speaking, it's actually harder to put a really flat floor in something like this. Just check out something like the Volkswagen ID Buzz. And speaking of the ID Buzz, if you want more cargo capacity or more passenger room in your 3-row EV, that's basically the only other option. All right, let's take a look around the interior. Keep in mind, this is a calligraphy trim, so obviously the lower end trims aren't going to look quite like this, but we do have an absolutely enormous panoramic moonroof in here, and it has a power shade and the front pane opens as well. So if you're interested in a big glass panel that actually does something, you might want to check out this before you look at an R1T. You can see that Hyundai has put the air vents for the rear passengers up there in the ceiling. I definitely prefer that. This model also has some features that we may or may not get in the United States. We have the big LCD screens back there. We'll take a look at those in just a second. The rear seats also massage and vibrate. They're also heated and ventilated in this trim. We get height adjustable shoulder belts and height adjustable head restraints. And we have a 2-tone interior. It may be difficult to tell on camera, but this is sort of an ivory, maybe an off-white, whatever you want to call that, and sort of a medium gray. I do think that the chestnut brown interior is probably the most attractive to my eye. We have pretty aggressive bolstering for the seat back cushions, relatively flat seat bottom cushions, but this has the ottoman on the passenger side. Oddly though, the front passenger seat is probably the least special after the third row because this seat does not massage, it does not vibrate, but it does heat and ventilate. On the doors, we find a solid percentage of soft touch materials, including an entire soft touch upper section and midsection of the door with that perforation pattern, as you can see there. There's some mints hanging out in what is kind of a combination door handle and storage pocket, I guess you could say, because I definitely found myself stuffing stuff in there as we were driving along. Bottle holder down there at the bottom of the door, ambient lighting everywhere. Of course, harder plastics below. Now, clearly, the one thing we're not going to get in America is the side view camera. Over on the dashboard, we find a soft touch upper section of the dash. Lots of this silvery plastic. I am concerned that over time this may start to show scratches or chips or something like that. I kind of wish that we had the same sort of injection molded material on these two sections of the dashboard. We have an ambient lighting strip that is shining on this really intriguing texture. You can see calligraphy stamped in there. This kind of gives me a Formica countertop vibe. And then moving on to the dashboard, we have a big 2-screen setup here, but we don't find climate controls between them like we find in the EV9. There's a center channel speaker there and a new version of the head-up display software. Those are difficult to film, so unfortunately I'm not going to show you that, but it features album art from your connected smartphone and turn-by-turn lane directions. More ambient lighting running right there across the dashboard, big air vents, and lots of physical and touch buttons for things like the climate control and the infotainment system. I appreciate the number of buttons that we get in here. Below that, we have a UV sanitization on-off button for the sanitizing tray. It's a little bit difficult to show you, but I can actually move the center console out of the way to give you a better view. USB cables dangling around there. That's the UV sanitization compartment below there. We then have a storage area for your knickknacks, things like that. 2 USB charge-only ports there, 100 watts each. This interface port interfaces with CarPlay or Android Auto, but again, you can also go wireless if you want to. Now, speaking of that center console, it does slide forward and backward. There's a little handle there. That's how you slide it manually. We have 2 cup holders over there, the drive mode selector over here, and the terrain mode selector. You toggle between those, and then that becomes the toggle to make your choice. Auto brake hold, 360-degree camera button, and a single Qi wireless charging mat. I am surprised that we didn't get 2. We then have a big storage compartment right there. You can see there's tons of stuff going on. Then there is a removable tray inside that gives us access to the entire storage area, which is quite deep, can be accessed from both sides, right like that. And then there's also a pull-out door back there in the rear. The instrument cluster is running an updated version of Hyundai's software, and the design does change based on the drive mode that you're in. It does change a little bit as well with the terrain modes, but not quite as much as some of the other modes. So we don't have any sort of animation and mudslinging in that display. Now, on this side, if I turn off the camera, we have the latest Hyundai infotainment software. You've probably seen that before, but over here on the EV page, we get lots of additional details. You can see your consumption over time, battery statistics once the vehicle's been driven over 3,000 kilometers, charging controls, etc. And importantly, there's also the ability in this software, if I actually move to the right page, to manually precondition the battery for faster DC fast charging. You can see right now the battery temperature is low because it's about 6 degrees Celsius outside. Now, unlike the most recent Volkswagen products, those have a really handy feature where they tell you how fast it will charge now and how fast you could charge after the battery was warmed up. Unfortunately, we don't get that kind of information here. The steering wheel gives me a bit of a Volvo vibe with this 2-tone wrapping around there. It's a round wheel with a squarish airbag cover. We have the 4 dots there like we find all the way around the vehicle. That represents H in Morse code, just in case you're wondering. Regenerative braking paddles on the back of the steering wheel here. Controls for the adaptive cruise control system on that side and the infotainment system right over there. Nice touch. This is a powered tilt telescopic steering column, and Hyundai gives us a power button, just in case you're wondering. It's over here on the shifter stalk. So this is the same shift stalk we find in Ioniq 5, but we have a power button there that we don't find in every Hyundai with this same sort of shifter. Okay, it's time to get the Ioniq 9 out on the road, and Sophie and Bay from Redline is here with me. We've been driving all around South Korea, and I think we have finally found a road with nobody on it.
Thank God, Alex, because we have just been stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic everywhere as we're trying to get our way back to Seoul from Busan.
And this is good because this is kind of the road I wanted to see what the Ioniq 9 would be like on, because this is about 5,700 pounds of Ioniq 9. Now, exact curb weight figures are not ready yet. You think it's probably closer to 5,900 pounds, right?
Yeah, and that's based on what the weight is for the Kia version of this car, which is honestly closer to 6,000 pounds. The Kia felt heavy. How do you think this one feels?
I would say this doesn't feel light by any stretch. This definitely is on the heavy side.
Oh, look at that, 2 Ioniq 5s.
We're in a construction zone, but hey, you know, we're making it work.
Yeah, the roads and driving around here in Korea are interesting because there's speed limits that are low, very low speed limits everywhere.
Very low.
And we had to drive pretty far to get away from the crowded city centers and the low speed limits, but now we're on this country road and
many speed cameras.
Yes.
But we did find, I kid you not, an area where we could do a 0 to 60, and you know what? We only exceeded the speed limit by 2 kilometers an hour.
Oh, good. Yes.
In the 0 to 60 test. So we can give you that number, and that number is about 4.7 to 4.8 seconds, depending on the run that we did at 70% state of charge. That's actually pretty good.
Yeah, and it actually pretty much closely matches what I got in like the last EV9 GT line that I tested, which was 4.5 seconds. I expect this car to be able to do the same. It does have, Alex, though, 50 more horsepower than the Kia version.
But it also has a battery pack that is pretty big. I mean, this is about 10% larger than the battery pack that we find in the EV9, and a decent amount bigger than the battery that we find in really most of the competition, except for the R1S and the Volvo. I don't know about you, but for some reason driving this, interior design, not exactly Volvo, but some of the color scheme and certainly the exterior, I do get a bit of Volvo.
Yeah, for sure. And that's not a bad thing because I mean, if you're going to copy a brand or emulate a brand, Volvo is a good brand to do it in. The interior for me for this car is pretty nice. The seats have been comfortable. We've been driving this thing, Alex. Like yesterday we drove it. We drove this thing yesterday like 6 hours. Today we have another basically 5 hours ahead of us. So it's a really great road trip car.
It is. Now, unfortunately, back to the numbers for a bit, we don't have any 60 to 0 stopping distance estimates just yet because it probably wouldn't be fair. It's pretty cold out here, 35 degrees. Comparing that to our normal test scores done at usually around 65 degrees Fahrenheit just doesn't seem overly rational. But I think that the brake pedal feel is really good in this. I don't know about you, but I think the regenerative braking has a nice feel to it. And I also like the paddles.
Yeah, the regen paddles are nice because you can kind of choose your regen level on demand, and you can go from nothing to really heavy one pedal drive. I personally like somewhere in between, so I like how Hyundai gives you that customization.
Now, I think not every car company does the regen paddles that well. I'm not the biggest fan of the single paddle, for instance, that we find on some General Motors vehicles, even the variable one where you pull harder and you get more regen.
Right.
I much prefer this adjusting of the throttle liftoff regen, and it does get pretty aggressive. There is a one pedal I-pedal mode.
Yes.
And then there's that auto mode. I just don't know how I feel about the auto mode.
Yeah, I personally have tried it in my other Hyundai and Kia and Genesis EVs, and I don't like it either. I find it to be too variable. I would rather just kind of leave it in the mid setting myself. I also personally like regen braking, but I know you don't really love it as much in day-to-day driving. It can kind of just get annoying.
I don't like the one pedal. I like to being able to choose what I want. So if I'm going downhill, I might want more throttle liftoff regen, but I generally don't like the ultra aggressive one pedal mode. So I like the fact that you can have that. And if you have multiple people driving the same car, like your spouse or your kids or whatever is driving the car, you know, they can have their setting and you can have your setting. I just like that ability to vary. For anybody that's not familiar with the auto mode, basically what it's doing is it's using the radar sensor up front, and it's going to add or dial back the regen based on how far you are from the car in front of you.
Yeah, and this thing is a relatively easy car to drive, and it's also a good car to drive smoothly. So I think that's important because some of these EVs, they don't tune their regen braking or the brake pedal really well, and it can take a little bit of time to get used to. Just the smoothness and how to actually drive the car smooth. Speaking of smoothness, though, what do you think of the ride quality of this thing, Alex?
Not a lot of cushion. So on those bigger speed bumps, you will notice the little bit of thump in the back as the suspension is reaching its limit. But most of what I noticed was just really good, consistent, long-distance ride travel or ride quality, with the exception that you will feel the minor bumps, I think, because of that lack of cushion on the tire.
Yeah, I think they also could have made it better if they just done an adaptive suspension on this car.
I would love to see an adaptive suspension.
I think Kia does it on the EV9 GT, which we haven't driven yet. But
so that makes me wonder. I wonder if it's going to come in this.
An N-line, perhaps?
Now, ride quality in here feels more normal, and I would say better than the R1S. The R1S, even with the revised suspension, that air suspension has an unusual tune to it. It doesn't feel like a Grand Cherokee or a Land Rover with an air suspension. It has kind of its own feel to it, kind of like the R1T does in a way. The R1T doesn't feel like a Ram 1500 with an air suspension, for instance. This is also different than something like the Volvo, because even though it has more of a normal air suspension, the Volvo has kind of a softer ride, I would say.
Yeah, the Volvo actually was very soft. I remember when we drove that thing. I haven't had one for a week, but when we drove it on the first drive, I noticed it was almost a little wallowy, a little bit too soft at times.
I kind of liked it. It was very, very comfortable. I do have to admit that I was expecting the South Korean Ioniq 9 to be tuned on the softer side, since a lot of South Korean market cars tend to be softer than the ones that come to the US. But I suspect this is going to be exactly what we're going to get in the US. That's my suspicion.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I mean, overall, I think that they've pretty much delivered what you expect for a vehicle of this caliber. It's a large family SUV. Compared to the last EV9 I tested, I actually think the body control is a little bit better. I remember the EV9, you would hit a bump and you would the car would really feel unsettled at times. This car, I didn't really notice that as much.
I have to admit, I kind of wonder what the long-range rear-wheel drive model is going to be like, which is another interesting one, because that's going to be the most efficient, longest range model. And that means we should probably talk about range. So far on this journey, we've been averaging 4.2 kilometers per kilowatt hour, so that is a little bit below 3 miles per kilowatt hour. But yesterday we averaged about 5 kilometers per kilowatt hour. So that was actually right about exactly 3 miles per kilowatt hour. That's kind of right in line with the battery size and the range, though. They're saying 311 miles EPA. I was suspicious of that.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday we were more in stop-and-go traffic, which is arguably the better, route for EVs. You're going to be the most efficient in that. But yeah, I mean, I'll be curious to see what this thing is like in actual real-world testing. Because, I mean, on full charge, I think we started today at like 99%. It was showing like about 570 kilometers on a full charge. So, I mean, the EV9, if I remember correctly, was actually relatively efficient. So I wouldn't be surprised if this thing could actually get 300 miles of real-world range. Yeah,
today we got lost. We climbed a mountain. We 0 to 60 tested. So our fuel economy obviously should be kept with that in mind.
Yep.
And it has been really cold. Yes, today it's 32 degrees, and this is the warm spot. Yesterday we started out and it was 20 degrees Fahrenheit. It was very, very cold, and so the heat pump was definitely doing its thing. This does have a heat pump standard, which is a nice touch. But I have to admit, if I were to shop for something along these lines, as I'll need to very soon, I think, Buzz was high on my priority list. I think this is, it's still not as family friendly as a Buzz.
No.
Let me be frank there. It's not as roomy, not as family friendly, but I think this is a better fit because of that extra range. If this could give me an honest to goodness 280, 290 miles of range, this would mean I could take the kids to grandma's house without having to DC fast charge on the way back. And that's something that I think is really, really in my mind and preventing me from putting that Buzz firmly on the consideration list.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that those are probably the two of the best that you've narrowed it down to. I mean, I would agree that the Buzz is a lot more family friendly. It's a box, it's a van, but Volkswagen's biggest downfall is the fact that the range is like 70, 80 miles less than this. So it'll be also interesting to me is to see which people actually, I mean, obviously we know that the Palisade is going to outsell this car, but I'll be curious to see if there are going to be people that come in looking at a Palisade and then they switch over to the Ioniq 9 instead.
Now, how do you feel about the elephant in the room, which we haven't talked much about, but we must now before we go, is the Tesla Model X. The Tesla Model X is the first three-row EV in the United States. It had been the best-selling for quite some time. It is no longer, by the way, the best-selling three-row EV.
No.
But I think it is still somehow the benchmark. Just like 3 Series doesn't need to be the bestseller to be the benchmark in that segment.
Right.
I think Model X still is because of its practicality. It was the first. And it has been by far the longest range for quite some time.
Yeah, I mean, it's the OG of the segment, so it's hard. You can't really ignore it. It's impossible to ignore. I have not driven a Model X in a while. I think the last one I drove was probably 4 or 5 years ago. I honestly never liked the way they drove. They
really?
They felt really like big, heavy, and wallowy to me. So I also don't love. But like, there's a line for me between comfort and like it's gonna make me sick. Like it's too wallowy and floaty. I also didn't love the build quality of those Teslas. Like there were always a lot of rattles and squeaks, and also they're so expensive.
Yes, that is true.
I also don't think the styling of the Model X has aged well.
No, I think the egg shape never really worked for me. I have to admit, the one thing I love about the Model X is actually the ride quality, because the air suspension is fantastic, I think, in that one, especially the latest tune of it, the final version of it that we have now.
Yep.
I have never cared for the ride quality in the 3 or the Y. I think they're just a little too firm.
Okay.
But the X was just, you know, soft and comfy, big luxury car, that big luxury car feel. And this is definitely firmer than that. Again, I think I'd be interested to see what this would be like with an adaptive suspension. But of course, the Plaid is bonkers fast.
Oh, yes.
Now for a bit of bad final news. We don't know exact pricing for the Ioniq 9 in North America just yet. But we know that in South Korea, it starts at around 46,000 US dollars, or the equivalent thereof. Now, in Korea, pricing structures tend to be a little bit different. So Ioniq 5 in the US and Korea, they don't exactly translate. I suspect this is going to be somewhere north of $50,000 when it comes to the United States. The Kia EV9 is in that pretty similar pricing range, starting somewhere around $50,000, $55,000, going on to just under $80,000 ending. This is probably going to be in a very similar range. Although I wouldn't be surprised if Hyundai decided to undercut their corporate cousin just to get the Ioniq 9 rolling. And remember, again, this is going to be built in the United States, and it's going to qualify for that federal tax credit as long as it continues to exist. That's a big, big deal, because versus something like the ID Buzz or even a Volvo EX90, which, if you squint, kind of looks like an Ioniq 9, they don't qualify for that tax credit. And that's going to be a big, big difference for families that maybe are on the border of, should I get an EV, should I not get an EV? Also a big deal, this is going to charge faster than either the Volvo or the ID Buzz. This is actually going to be one of the fastest charging 3-row EVs available in the United States. It's not going to have range quite as long as a Tesla Model X. Although I will caution everybody out there that, as always, Tesla is not calculating their range on the same scale, the same general testing parameters that other manufacturers are. If you want to know more about that, there's some deep dive videos into why that is. But how that impacts real world range, it's going to remain to be seen. This has done, however, really quite well out here in South Korea. We were averaging between 2.5 and 3 miles per kilowatt hour, even down here where it has literally been below freezing. So solid range, solid practicality. And that's what the Ioniq 9 brings, is that practicality of that big third row. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section. And is this on your list? Are you leaning more towards the EV9? I have to admit, as much as I like the EV9's design, I think this is more elegant and more attractive. I would have to get the calligraphy though, because this whole eyebrow thing going on in the other models, I am not a big fan of that one. And it is worth noting though, if you were to buy another version of the Ioniq 9, you could just have those little eyebrows painted to match the body color of the vehicle, or wrapped or something along those lines. That's probably what I would do if I couldn't afford to step up into the calligraphy trim, because this is much more harmonious to my eye than the big black sections that we find in those other trims. But it's hard to deny the range and the practicality that we find in the Ioniq 9. Let me know what you think about all that. Find us on all the related channels, and of course find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the X's, all those other things. We'll see all of you next week.